Well, thanks everyone for coming. We are talking about the unbanked globally in general, and also specifically in Somalia, and what we can do about it. So I'm Mohammed Ibrahim. I'm from Somalia, and I worked in Somalia for a few years, and now I live in Melbourne, doing research and some work at Melbourne Uni and also at Swinburne University. And my interest today is really to share with you my experience in the field, the challenge we are facing, and hopefully looking towards a solution. So I will talk for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then I will let you ask questions and we can discuss. So the theme is really about the de-risking policies of the banks, meaning our banks here in Australia and other developed countries, and how that de-risking policy impacts people back home or any other developing countries. This is a huge theme. So with the time given, we really can't cover all the issues, but what I will try to do is focus on a couple of things which will highlight why these de-risking policies of the banks, number one, are discriminating. Number two, it's producing unintended consequences. In other words, the idea was to help clean up the system, but in fact, it's causing some negative impact on people who rely on remittances and getting help from their folks in the developed world. So let me unpack that. There's a lot of words, a lot of ideas in there. So let me go through them so that as a part of setting the scene, you will understand what it is we're facing. In Australia and other developed countries, there are businesses who work in the remittance business, or we call them hawala. Now, their function is primarily to help people support their families back home. And they do a good job in that way. But things have changed. And although those remittances companies are licensed and they're doing legitimate businesses, they need banking infrastructure. In other words, the money they collect, they're not deposit takers. In other words, they cannot keep that money themselves. They have to keep that money in a bank and then later on transfer that money to the recipient countries. So if we, for example, use Somalia as an example, people in Melbourne or Sydney will go to the remittance business, send money to their brothers and sisters and mothers and dads, and then the remittance business will go to the bank and transfer the money. That used to be the case, but not anymore. What has changed? Because the banks came up with this de-risking policy and they said, look, we don't really trust you anymore, therefore we'll close all your accounts. Now that creates huge problem because it cuts the link between people here and their communities back home and the support they used to give. So what was the solution for a short time? The solution was for a short time to take the money in a bag and fly it to Dubai and then get it to Somalia or Kenya or Uganda or wherever else it's going to. Now, that also worked for a while. And it was short-term solution, but that is no longer the case. Why? Because of the COVID-19 issue, there are no flights. What that really means is then, even if you wanted to take the money in a bag, you can't do that anymore. So here's the unintended consequence. In other words, I'm sure the banks were not deliberately trying to punish the communities, but they were just trying to protect themselves, I guess. But by trying to do that, the outcome is the remittance money is not getting through. So few of us worked on this and we developed, for example, apps that technically can resolve this issue, but even those apps ultimately need banking infrastructure. And also the financial literacy, some people are not really very savvy with using apps, so therefore they still prefer to go to a shop, fill the forms, and send the money that way. So that is really the challenge, and that's why this topic we're calling how do we bank the unbanked? It is people who cannot get access to financial institutions, who have no bank accounts because they can't even afford perhaps to open bank accounts. We're talking about back home. And the remittance business that was helping is no longer functioning. So that is really the challenge we're dealing with, and we're trying to find a solution for it. So what have we done? What have we done to resolve this issue? We worked with academia, for example, Swinburne University and other universities, Monash and Melbourne University. There are people trying to come up with ideas to resolve this issue. And to be fair, the intention was never, this is my personal feeling, I don't think the government's intention or the bank's intention was ever to cause problems or to banish anyone, but it just, the way it was done was a bit complicated. And because of that, I guess governments are too busy with a lot of issues. It's being overlooked. Now we're communicating with the Treasury and a few other people trying to resolve this issue. So that is really the topic now today we want to discuss, and see if we can come up with some ideas and between us and other people who will watch this program to contribute and help. Because if certain policies use just a wide brush and say, look, we don't trust one or two bad apples, therefore everyone should be banished, I think that's unfair. On the other hand, if the time has come, we have to move to different technology, perhaps then we also, as part of the community, we should help our communities get educated in the financial literacy part, or how to use the technology, so that they can even get out of this whole remittance business. So that's really the issue we're trying to talk about it. And so we're very fortunate. This week is actually the Financial Inclusion Week, and that's why we thought, by joining the community and highlighting this issue that sometimes overlooked, because not everyone is facing the same problem, we're trying to say, look, what can we do to help resolve this issue? Now, let me just go to next step in terms of, now we discussed what the problem is, what solutions are on the table, what can we do? So it's always easy to find out what the problem is or talk about the problem, but it's not as easy to come up with a working solution, something that will resolve this problem. So here are a couple of ideas I'm working on as part of my research. The global level, there are institutions who are focused on this. Now, let me quickly now go into, okay, now we know what the problem is and what technology is available. What solutions am I recommending? Now, I want to mention two global institutions, UN agencies. This slide you're looking at is the UPU, the Universal Postal Union, and they developed a system called the International Financial System. What it does, in brief, is basically similar to what the remittance businesses are doing. So the postal offices, and there are more post offices around the world than bank branches. As you know, banks are only interested in where people are, and they want to make money and get more clients. But the postal service helps the people, and they are in more places than banks. So the UPU developed this system that will work in every town and every village where there is a postal office. So my idea is, and the research I'm doing, is to see how can that be developed or expanded so that almost all the developing countries can use. Now there are only a few countries are using. Another institution, UN institution, that is in this space that's trying to help is the ITU, who are working on what we call the digital financial services over the last few years, many years in fact. And they're trying to come up with a standard, a way to resolve this whole idea of remittances and financial services, digital financial services, and help with the migration to the cashless society as we move forward. Now, again, I'm condensing a lot of ideas, but let me try to unpack this. So I mentioned two UN agencies, the UPU and the ITU, who are both working hard to provide some ideas, come up with some solutions that will help us move away from the old fashion of remitting and into the high-tech area. So that is an area that we really should encourage and promote and contribute to move forward and to produce some outcome that will be good for the rest of the community. Now, I will move on now to the third part of my talk, which is we talked about the risking problem the banks introduced and how that impacted the remittance businesses. This is the small shops that help the local community versus the big banks. For example, if you're in Australia, let's say the four major banks, ANZ, NAB, Westpac, and CBA, and how the government, while they're trying to help, could not really solve that problem. So as we speak, we're on a stalemate. So the banks are not still accepting the remittance businesses to use their services to transfer money. I started my talk with very strong word. I said that policy, that the risking policy, is a discriminatory policy. Now, I want to go back to that because it's unfair for me to say the banks are discriminating against the small remittance businesses without not justifying. I have to substantiate that issue and that argument. And here's my gut feel. Now, this is not based on research, but it's on my own personal experience where I went to 14 banks, not the four major banks, but even newer banks, the small banks, and even the regional banks like Bendigo Bank. And what happened to me personally, and this is documented and it can be verified if people are interested, I can share that with you. I couldn't open a bank account, a business bank account that will do remittance. And the answers given are basically because I am licensed with Austrac. Now, here's the irony. If an individual or a business is licensed by Austrac, you would have thought that's a plus. That means you are in the good books, you are actually a legitimate business, but the banks do the reverse. Because you are licensed by Austrac, you actually get disqualified. Isn't that amazing story? And it's very hard to explain to a lot of our authorities and our politicians. I wrote to my local MD about this. But having said that, I started saying that policy is discriminatory. And why I think it is discriminatory? Because other remittance companies, big companies like Western Union and so on, they still do their banking services, even if they are not Australian company in Australia, but they can still use our banks. I don't want to go into the detail of taxation or what have you, but that's for other people to study and to research. But that was really the reason I started with the risking policy is discriminatory. So that I will leave that topic now there for the time being and elaborate a little bit more about the other two issues I mentioned. And then I will stop and let you ask questions and we can discuss this. The other two issues I mentioned were the need for, I guess, the government to interfere and also the international or global institutions like the UN agencies to work harder to make their products available to all countries, especially the developing countries, to resolve this problem. The ITU sets the standards for mobile phones and all those telecommunication stuff. The UBU deals with the postal services. Between the two, we have both the telecommunication and the post. Now, if you then introduce other people like the BIS and the people who do the banking institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, there is a possibility for coordination to come up with a solution that will work for everyone. And that will help the millions of poor people who cannot get access to banks and who cannot now get their remittance. And finally, what I really want to finish with at the last part is with all that negative issues and all those challenges we're facing, I'm still optimistic. And why am I optimistic? Because I think there are new ideas, new technologies coming on board that will solve this problem, especially with the fintechs who are developing a lot of apps that will bypass all these problems, and they might not even need banks as we know them, and they can still remit money. So this idea people are familiar with about mobile money might solve a big part of this problem. Now, even mobile money, which was a big item and a lot of people are excited about when we talk about M-Pesa, or in the case of Somalia, EVC or ZAD and so on, even that is now becoming a bit of a history. It's becoming like something that we have moved away from. Why? Because now there are a lot of other assets coming to the market, all the cryptocurrencies and all these other digital currencies. And what I want to finish my discussion with is the governments finally are catching up. They realized the fintechs and the technology is moving so fast for them. They have to also join the club and do something. Therefore, this latest idea about the central bank's digital currencies will resolve some of these problems, but they're not now. It will take time. So there will be some time lag between when they will become available for all of us to use and resolve this problem we're all facing. Just one last item I want to mention to our Somali folks who are listening this program. The problem we're facing is not really unique to us. So a lot of people, for example, think this is an issue that is peculiar to Somalia. In fact, this is a global issue. What is peculiar to Somalia and is in a way unique to Somalia is how the whole financial sector works. And that is another discussion, another lecture for another day, I guess. But suffice to say, it's a legacy of the 20 plus years of non-functioning government and so on. So hopefully as our government becomes more organized and more effective, those problems will go. Just to finish that area, with the mobile money in Somalia and the whole monetization of Somalia, we're dollarized. We actually use dollar without ever passing legislation. In other words, there's no law in Somalia that says the currency we use is dollar, but nevertheless, it just happened to be dollar. I just wanted to throw that in because it's one of those other variables that make life a bit more exciting. I want to stop here and let you ask questions, and we can then continue, either elaborate these ideas or elaborate them, or see if we can find some ideas from you or other people later on. So I want to thank you again, and I'll stop here. So if there are any questions, they're welcome.
Yeah, let's go back to the very beginning, which was the decision by the banks to unbank these companies had unintended consequences. Can we go back one step? I'd like to mention the fact that 99% of remittances in Australia go through the banks. There's only 1% that goes through the remittance companies. And initially, what the banks wanted was to reclaim that 1%. So that's the crux of it. And the excuses used for that to happen was, one of them was that the remittance industry was not compliant. When you look at that issue, today, I can say banks are not more compliant than the remittance industry. If you look at the recent history, the fines that were presented to some of the banks proves to you that all is not well in the banking system. So that's what I'm trying to say is, it's that argument does not hold water that the remittance industry is not compliant.
Okay, well, thank you. Now I'll take one more question and then I'll answer, or I'll try to add my comments. So let's get. Okay, well, I'll try to say a few words about your comment or about your question about the banks. The point you're making is valid. The banks, there's even a rumor, there's even some talk about the banks competing with the remittance companies. I don't want to go that far, but it looks like that. It seems that might be the case, but I will still not cross that line. Let's just stay and say the banks are trying to protect themselves, because we all know what happened recently with the Royal Commission and how the banks were hit hard and they were fined and so on. But my interest is, while the banks are trying to protect themselves and their shareholders and so on, it's also hurting part of the community. It's causing problems, and this is what we're calling the unintended consequence. Now, the challenge is, can we find a balance where the banks can listen to the community, or through the government, both the government and the banks can listen to the community and say, look, what is actually the problem? See, the way I look at it is this. I did this myself as part of my research. I actually formed a company, got an Austrac license, went through the motions just to see what exactly was going on, because the story was too complicated and sometimes even far-fetched to believe. But once I went through the process myself, now I can see bits of what contributes to the problem. And we are almost now at a stage where if we can come together and write discussion papers and some reports and send them to our local MPs and send to the authorities, people will listen and they will understand. But at the moment, we're at the stage whereby there's still a lot of confusion and even some anger. Basically, people saying why the bank should close my account after 20 years, 30 years in this country. I was a good citizen. I was doing the right thing. I'm doing my business. I'm licensed. What have I done wrong? So that is really where the challenge is. How do we make that message clearer to the authorities and say, look, the intention was A, but in fact, the outcome happened to be Z. So we need to find a way of reconciling the two. So it's not easy, but I'm optimistic. I think it can be resolved. Any other comments or questions?
I've
We
got
have
a
another
comment
20 minutes, so the more questions, the better, please.
All right, I've got a comment to make. Hi, it's Fazal speaking here. The situation is really a combination of a lot of factors. One is definitely the banks taking the opportunity to reduce, to increase their market share of remittances, because they do not like small businesses doing remittances and using them. They feel that they feel that the risk reward is not sufficient. I mean, you might be transferring $100,000, but they only get $20 on the fee if you're doing AUD to AUD, and if you're doing USD, they get a bit more. But in the scheme of things, in a bank, they feel that the risk of a fine from somewhere, anywhere, of hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions of dollars, is not worth the risk of doing the business. So they're prepared to lose maybe $80,000, $100,000, $250,000 in fees and charges a year from a company, because the risk is just not there. Now, some of you or most of you would know the company I work for, which is FlexiWallet. We transfer, I'll be quite honest, we transfer about $300 million a year out of the country, mostly in AUD, probably about 5 million in USD. That's part of the problem. I've been told that AUD to AUD is not interesting to the banks, to the general banking marketplace. They need to have conversions because USD is more usable offshore. So they've got Vostro accounts collecting AUD account balances, which they cannot then sell back for people to use in Australia. So it's a bit of a one-way flow, and they feel that that is part of the problem. So it's a combination of commercial intent, fear of inability to manage risk to their satisfaction, and they feel the risk reward is just nowhere near justifies doing the business. Now, that is just a summary of the of our viewpoint, because I mean, with all our muscle from a publicly listed company group, so on, we lost all our NAB accounts. I mean, 73 accounts, they closed it. They're happy to keep the rest of our group together with our millions in term deposits and so on and so forth, but they're not prepared to do remittance. So, you know, I mean, you're definitely behind the 8 ball in a big way. It's, I mean, we have spoken to the politicians, to the finance committee, the Senate Financial Committee, the people on there, Senator Patterson, Senator Jane Hume, who are personal friends. But the bottom line is they cannot force a bank to take you on as a customer, right? I mean, the banks say it's a free country. If they want to do that, they better start the Commonwealth Banking Corporation again and have a government bank to take over the risk. But they don't want it. And I guess when they're making $4-5 billion a year net profits, each bank, each half year, whatever it is, you know, the money that we do is nothing. So I don't think you will ever change that attitude with the big banks. The smaller banks, as you go down the line, yeah, you're easy to deal with because you're talking to the directors and the boards and the senior management. Because I mean, in a big bank, you know, you've got 40,000 people and you're talking to number 39,999. So by the time it gets up the ladder, it won't get up the ladder. So, but they also, they feel most of the new banks, what we call the neobanks, we've been through about 6 of them, talking to them, not through them. They are not interested in doing international, right? They're happy to do domestic, but they want to do SME lending, they want to do term deposits, anything that's low risk and in their mind higher gain. So they feel the local market is enough for them. We have, it's a problem. So we are approaching this in a way of setting up our own bank because we thought that was the only way to get around this. But COVID has come in and we've got a 1-year delay now before we even get our APRA approval. And so we're looking at 2021, 22 before we can do anything. So, and the whole basis of that bank is aimed at, I'm not doing a commercial for the bank, believe me, it was aimed at the migrant community because we feel we can manage the risk. We are comfortable with it and we can mitigate it. So, but the big banks are not prepared to think like that. I mean, they have said, you know, we are just not used to looking at it. They're not used to dealing with, for example, all of you all run your own companies and you're the directors and you make a decision and you can make a decision on the spot. Whereas the banks, the staff that you deal with are so far down the chain, they cannot make a decision. And by the time they try and explain your business model up the ladder, they don't want to, you know, it's just too much. It's just too difficult. You're just one over 5. You understand? So I'm sorry to ramble on, but that's our feeling. And we have to explore other avenues to get our funds out of the country.
Okay, well, thanks, Fazal, but I just want to ask or follow up a point you raised. See, the issue, yes, now we know what the problem is, and we're almost at stalemate now, and we know what the banks can do and they can get away with legally, and what the government can do. But what else can we do? I'm still trying to explore other ideas. So, for example, let's pick one country, Somalia.
Right.
And it's having its own other problems, then to add to the point where by now people cannot receive money, that complicates what was already a complicated issue. So can, for example, the Somali government lobby the Australian government or other governments and say, look, in other words, can we come up with special cases and say, look, some countries are even worse off than others? I'm just thinking out here. So what do you reckon?
I believe that trying to play the bank's game by their rules, we will not win. You will not get, no matter what you do, whether how good your compliance is, how good anything is, they have made it in their minds that you're a high risk. The remittance industry is high risk. We don't want to do it. So you've got to work your way around those problems. Now, for example, I noticed that banks are happy to take on FX companies who are dealing and provide them liquidity. In other words, putting another layer between them and the marketplace. So if anything goes wrong, the FX company gets into trouble, not the bank. So that is that they are very risk averse. So that is one thing that can do, and we are exploring that as well. The other thing is to explore avenue of cryptocurrency, RippleNet. Now we are looking at that in a big way, and we will hopefully open up our first corridor to the Philippines, and then so on and so forth. But the problem seems to be for us in Australia is to get the money out of Australia, right? That's the first step. Whether we get it to Singapore or to Hong Kong or wherever, that seems to be the hardest part, because once you get that done, then it is actually not a little bit easier to move it around the world from Hong Kong or from Singapore or so on. But now, for example, if I want to send money from Flexi Wallet, they want me to send to a Flexi Wallet account. So I don't hold many accounts around the country. So maybe I go to Dareel Bank and say, open a Flexi Wallet account. Then I'm transferring Flexi Wallet to Flexi Wallet, and the bank is happy. They know it's a remittance transaction, but this is the hypocrisy that we have to work with. If they can tell their board that they're not doing remittance business, they're just dealing with Flexi Wallet, who's transferring to their own account overseas, they're happy, but they get the commissions. That's all they want.
Okay, well, I will allow other people to contribute, but also I want to remind people, people we're recording this and it will be shared publicly with hopefully the authorities and other global bodies to help us find a solution. I just want to throw in a few items here for those people who are not familiar with the remittance business, so that at least you can see in your mind what we're dealing with. The people, the customers, the people who send money, for example, Somalia, first of all, they're not sending a lot of money. So it's a son or a mother or a friend sending some money to a family. So the amount of money involved is actually not that much. And if we now introduce layers between the money, the origin to the destination, that might also increase the cost. So these are just another variable we need to think about and to keep in mind as we discuss these ideas. So I'm still interested to hear from other people, what else can we do? How can we resolve this issue, knowing it's been going on for a while now and we don't really see any light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
Hi, can I jump in here?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I raised my hand, but seems no one has seen.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize.
From the Real Bank, Somalia. It's very interesting. There is a wide topic covered here, but I'm interested the financial inclusion, and I'm coming from Somali perspective. Just to give you a little bit of background, just in the context of Somalia, then after that I'll revisit what the Somali banks in general and particularly the Real Bank can do when it comes to this very important topic. Some background, we're talking Somalia here, population of 12 million. Today I was checking the UN sort of monitoring population, it showed like 16 million. To me, I think I'm more close to the 12 million than the 16 million. This number, when we're talking the unbanked, less than 2.5% of that 12 million, I think it's close to 300,000 or around there, people who have bank accounts. More than 56% of the Somali household receive hawala or remittance, mainly the Somali diaspora around the world, places like Australia, America, UK, and all that. 46%, you're talking here almost a half of the population, one way or another. At the end of the month, they get money, $50, $100, average transaction, $250 USD. Out of that 56%, close to 60%, the money goes to a mobile wallet. So here, when you're talking in the context of unbanked, you can see 2.5% of population of 12 million compared to, come back to that figure, 46% of the household, that's half of the Somali population, 60% of them, what are we talking here? Close to 30% of the population, one way or another, you can say that they have a mobile wallet account. So what I'm trying to show you here is when we are talking a bank account, in the context of Somalia, we're talking less than 2.5%. But then when you flip the coin and see how many people are getting money through remittance in Somalia, that is 46%. For the sake of argument, let's flip that 4% and say 50%. That figure, 60% of that, around 30%, they have mobile wallet account. This is very conservative. Today, if you go to Somalia, people will dispute and say, hey, we're not talking here 30%, we're talking more than 50% of the people, they have a mobile wallet. So it is a dilemma. Here, when you're talking about financial inclusion, what one might think, 2.5% of the people got bank accounts, but then I can argue and say, look, we're talking 30% of the people, they already have a mobile wallet account. So this is some background information. I'm not sure whether I can share some slides here, but it was already mentioned that with all these figures we're talking, the money comes as US dollar. The Central Bank of Somalia, they have been trying for a while to come up the legal tender, the Somali shilling. As of now, the Somali economy is dollarizing. So let me give some background information, some quick numbers when it comes to remittance, hawala, and banking in Somalia. As we speak, there are 11 hawala registered companies with the Central Bank of Somalia. Since 2012, close to 10 hawalas went out of business. So currently we have 11 plus 10 that went out of business, 22. Out of those 22, today we have, if you visit the Central Bank of Somalia website, 11 of them registered. What happened to the 10? And we're not talking here the lower end of the remittance companies. We're talking big ones. You can say the mid-level. They went out of business. Why? Because mainly the risking strategy of the banks. I think Bazal, Mohammed, you all mentioned it. The banks, they're not doing this to punish people or remittance companies. They're doing for their own survival. You don't want to get $200,000 out of remittance companies and you get hit $1.3 billion. So we have to understand that. In terms of Somalia, those 11 hawala companies, they're really serving well those 12 million people in Somalia. If you look the banking side, again, according to the Central Bank of Somalia today, there are 13 licensed banks in Somalia. 10 of them are operational. 3 are yet to become operational. All except 3 banks, they got licenses for the last 5 years. In fact, 6 of those 13, they got their licenses for the last 2 years. In terms of going out of business, there's only one bank in the context of Somalia that went out of business for the history of what we know, the current Central Bank of Somalia license regime. What does that tell you? The remittance business, even though it's serving well the unbanked people of Somalia, they're really struggling. Last year, 2 medium-sized remittance companies went out of business. Compared to the banks, it's the other way around. The number of banks are growing. The number of banks that are out of going bankrupt is minimal, hardly any. One point I would like to make after this background information is the topic financial inclusion, the topic of the risking, the problems that people are facing on the ground, remittance companies. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? From commercial banks of Somali perspective, yes, there is. I wholeheartedly agree, my friend Vazal. If the major banks send money to a bank in Somalia, they might still come up excuses, and they can see that if it's anything to do with remittance, then it doesn't matter whether it's going to another bank, legally licensed bank in Somalia or not. But here is my, what I see as solution. And this is something that commercial banks of Somalia almost all agree. And in the context of the real bank, as I'm representing it, I can confirm you that we're all in it. This problem, whether it is the problem of the de-risking, whether it is the financial inclusion, or ultimately transferring money from one country to another, if we put our effort together with the help of ingenuity of people who are trying to meet the Millennium Goals, I'm not familiar with those terminologies, but whatever the United Nations, the old term, was it Millennium Goals? This financial inclusion. The real bank, as we speak, secured a SWIFT code. And as soon as we get that, what we are planning to do is get like-minded banks around the world. We will start in Africa, Kenya, Uganda, maybe other friendly countries around the region. And then we'll try the developed countries, countries like Australia, if we can secure one bank that can give us correspondent bank, Vostros account, partly what Vazal was talking, but differently, bank to bank. I think we can get a solution where we can serve the global community, where we can make the remittance business viable, where we can contribute a lot when it comes to the financial inclusion, where everyone can get a bank account. Thank you.
All right, well, Hamid, thanks for that. I think we've got 7 or 8 minutes. If there are other comments, questions, please welcome. Are there any other comments or questions? Now, while waiting for any hands to come up, I will just quickly summarize what we discussed. I think so far this has been interesting, I guess, forum with a few ideas that I'm interested to follow up later on, maybe offline. But the message that we really want to send to the rest of the community and the international community is there could be 1 or 2 bad apples, but not every remittance or every financial service is doing something wrong. So just because of certain incidents a whole country, or a whole continent, or a whole community shouldn't be punished. So having said that, still there are a lot of interesting ideas coming up. And the reason I'm very optimistic is with the fintech and the cryptocurrencies and a lot of the other ideas that are technically advanced might help resolve this issue. And hopefully after this, those people who are watching this program later on, I'll be quite happy to hear your comments and your feedback. So we still have another 5 minutes. Are there any other comments or questions? Yes, please go ahead, Ahmed.
Yeah, just to, we have spoken about this side of the equation, which is why banks are reluctant to open accounts for remittance companies. But when you look at the destination side, there is one problem which is persisting, which I don't think we have found a solution to it when we're talking about Somalia, which is the issue of identification, knowing your customer, which has always been a thorn on the side of the remittance companies. And it would be easier, I would say, if that problem was solved. Perhaps the real bank can clarify that if there has been some improvements, but as I knew it, there was still problems with the identification of customers or beneficiaries rather.
Yeah, let me just quickly jump in here, and I can probably update you with the ID cards for Somalia, or the identification process. There's a lot of work going on. Not the speed we would have liked. We would have liked this to be a lot faster and a lot more robust, but it is happening. The other more interesting issue you raised is the other side of the equation. In other words, in Australia, we have AUSTRAC that monitors and manages and looks after the whole fund transfer and so on. But what happens on the other side? Now, for your information and others who are watching this program later on, in fact, a lot of work went into this as well. And the idea was to set up SOMTRAC. I hope the new Somali government and the new finance minister and the security people will listen to this and perhaps revisit this issue. The idea was brilliant. The idea was basically to say, look, we have AUSTRAC in Australia. If we have the equivalent or the corresponding entity in Somalia called SOMTRAC or whatever other name you come up with, the two entities can work together end to end, and then there will be no further problems. In other words, if X sends money to Y in Somalia, it will be as simple as that. In other words, you can say end to end, the sender and the receiver are both known and problem solved. But it's one of those things that, like all other good ideas, they need to be implemented. It needs someone to actually stand up and do it. But I'm again optimistic. I think it can be done. And perhaps as we get to the last few minutes of our talk, maybe we can now share if there are other ideas. I know there are a lot of Somali remittance businesses in Australia who are doing cutting edge stuff, who are coming up with apps, with other technologies that can resolve some of these problems. Again, wrap up here, and I want to thank you all. Perhaps we should continue this in another format, in another session, in another way we can do it. But thanks for your time. It's been interesting to get to know you all and to hear your ideas. And hopefully, as other people watch, they're all welcome to contribute and inform us and tell us and share their ideas or your ideas. I will stop here. Thank you very much. With that, enjoy your day. If you're in Melbourne, hope the lockdown is not letting you down. So, okay, take care. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.